Zankina, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start with the first question. With the fragmentation of the Bulgarian parliament and the presence of 9 parties, what role does populism play in shaping public perception and voter alignment within Bulgaria's complex political landscape? Could this be the primary reason Bulgaria has gone to the polls 7 times since 2021? And what role have populist parties specifically played in contributing to this political crisis?
Well, certainly populism is a broad phenomenon that has contributed to the overall developments in the party systems, not only in Bulgaria, but throughout Europe. What we see is that populist appeals favor easy solutions and Manichean rhetoric and salvation narratives that make voters less patient with the difficulty and complexity of the democratic process, making them eager to vote for the next savior and the next quick solution. So certainly the growing penetration of populism, both as a discursive technique as well as a way of organizing parties and also as a way of moving away from hardcore ideologies, has contributed to the overall expectation by voters that they could be offered a simple solution by a next new party. So we have this combination of populism breeding a string of new parties that come in a never-ending cycle with new promises and a core body of voters that move from one new party to a newer party to a newer party. So certainly there's a lot to be said about populism contributing to an overall volatility of a party system, which in the case of Bulgaria was never sort of set in stone, as it is a rather young party system, 35 years. And we have already seen populist appeals for the last 20 or so years making their way, and those have become even more prevalent in the past 4 years.
Right. How has the shift from traditional political parties to personalistic, charisma-centered leadership impacted Bulgaria's democratic institutions? And what long-term effects do you foresee? What role do crises play in the rise of charismatic leaders in Bulgaria? And how have leaders like Simeon and Boriss utilized such movements to construct and sustain political charisma? What made GERB and Boyko Borisov so successful in Bulgarian elections since 2006?
So certainly, moving away from traditional parties is an important aspect for West European countries. The fact that the central mobilizing themes that sort of the frozen party thesis of divisions between rural and urban, industrial, and so forth have become less relevant as new issues such as migration, climate change, and so forth, including a series of economic crises have come forward. In the East European context, this idea of moving away from traditional political parties is less relevant because you do not have that long history of traditional political parties. We emerged from a one-party system that is anything but democratic, and it could be hardly called a party system. It is simply an authoritarian regime dressed in a party. So you're talking about building a party system while at the same time to the West, this party system that we're trying to emulate is gradually eroding. And we find ourselves now in a situation where those trends between West and East are less discernible because we have a lot more also inter-party connectedness and transnational party cooperation, the European party families and so forth, and also copying of this behavior and formulas, be it organizational formulas or personalistic behavior formulas. In the Bulgarian case, we did have a major change with the coming of Simeon, who was a very charismatic figure with a lot of legitimacy, and that certainly attracted a lot of votes. Now, during his tenure, he accomplished quite a lot. He delivered on a lot of the promises, but at the same time, he validated this personalistic model of charisma that then Boyko Borisov in a very different fashion was able to emulate. So the two could not be further apart in terms of character, objectives, and persona. But what is important is that Borisov was able to borrow the success and replicate the success of Simeon using his own personal appeal that is much more less refined, less graceful, but more focused on I'm the thug who comes and sorts things out, and I can handle criminals because I myself had to deal with this kind of environment for a long time. So what he gained immediately was credibility, and not only domestically, he gained credibility with the European People's Party, who endorsed him as soon as the party was formed in the 2007 elections already, first for the for Bulgaria European Parliament elections. And he has enjoyed this support throughout, because one thing that he delivers in Bulgaria is predictability and stability. And we see that he continually wins elections out of the in 15 years out of the 11 elections, parliamentary elections, he has lost only 2. And this is not to mention presidential elections that his candidate won twice, and also local elections, and of course, European Parliament elections. So he has been extremely successful, but again, the association of his party with corruption has managed to muster opposition, a combination of protest, grassroots, ground-up movements, as well as a series of populist parties and personalities that sort of ride on this protest wave. So we certainly have a protest wave which has undermined Borisov's ability to remain in power, as we have seen recently, but also has allowed for a lot of newcomers to come in and write on narratives of anti-corruption and criticism of GERB. And again, not all of those actors are necessarily legitimate in their sincerity of their appeals. And all of them, of course, have their political objectives and aim to get to power.
Right. How significant is Boyko Borisov's ability to distance himself from far-right oligarch Delian Peevski for GERB's potential coalition-building efforts? And how does this suggest about the influence of corruption-related sanctions on Bulgarian politics?
He has not been willing to distance himself, even in the aftermath of the elections on Sunday night. In his speech, he did not exclude Peevski and MRF New Beginning from a potential coalition building efforts. And even though the most likely and much needed potential partner for Borisov, Change Continues Democratic Bulgaria, have called for a cordon sanitaire on Delian Peevski, Borisov's party remains one of the few in parliament. Actually, every other party has joined this cordon sanitaire, except for Borisov's party. So he seems to have either some kind of dependencies that are not obvious to the public, to the broader public, with Peevski, whether it's a question of money, financing, compromise, but he seems to be shying away from breaking with that connection. And that, of course, is going to be very difficult. It's going to pose a huge challenge to finding other coalition partners and build a potential governing formula.
Given the rise of pro-Russian and far-right groups like Vazrazhdane, how do you interpret the current balance between Bulgaria's pro-European aspirations and the growing appeal of populist anti-Western ideologies? How might Bulgaria's prolonged political instability impact its path towards EU integration? And do you foresee populist narratives either accelerating or hindering this process within the current coalition negotiations?
The nationalist vote in Bulgaria has had traditionally 10 to 12% of the votes, starting with Ataka in 2005. And we do see that in these latest elections, if we look at the Vazrazhdane and other new parties like Mech, Sword, or Velichia, Glory, they collectively gathered over 20% of the vote. But a lot of this vote, we need to be cautious. It's not necessarily nationalist vote, because a good portion of this vote is protest vote. And what nationalists have been able to do is to cash in on this overall discontent on a number of issues. From the economic crisis to the position, the war in Ukraine, and they have been able to gather sort of to become a magnet for various groups who have experienced different types of discontent and collect that electorate. Now, whether the supporters are truly nationalist or they're simply unhappy is beyond the point if they actually manage to get to power. Nationalists who once in government do act as nationalists, and we have seen now that they have managed to push through two legislations in the previous parliament, one against LGBT propaganda, so-called, in the schools, and another one against foreign agents, similarly to what we have seen in Hungary and in Georgia. Also, we do know that these parties benefit from not only sympathy of the Putin regime, but often also financing. And if we examine their financial reports, what we notice is that consistently for the past 10 years, we see that every time around European elections, some amount of money, not an awfully huge amount of money, but unexplained amount of money shows up in the reports of those populist parties. And this is very, very interesting because it shows also in different fashions. It could be listed as donations or as memberships, and these things change from year to year. And this lack of consistency really shows that these funds are coming from somewhere else. Of course, it is a different story tracking them directly to the Putin regime, but you know, we know that Western parties such as Rassemblement National have already been known for that. So we can guess with a great certainty that they do get also Russian support. In addition, they get also a lot of support in terms of disinformation and trolls on the internet that benefit their narrative and erode other narratives, as well as simple basic facts.
In your view, what are the primary challenges for pro-European coalitions such as PPDB in countering populist narratives, especially regarding issues like judicial reform and anti-corruption efforts, given the top-down, externally driven approach to reform in Bulgaria? What specific measures do you believe could enhance the sustainability and local ownership of these reforms?
Well, it doesn't help that the champions of judicial reform and pro-EU orientation themselves prove to be quite incompetent and themselves use quite a lot of populist narratives. And they also rely on a lot of swing votes from the right, from the left, and from the center. So the first thing, the first order is to establish themselves as legitimate political figures who are capable of predictable political behavior, which they have not proven to be. Even though many of the reforms they have proposed have sound programmatic appeals behind them, the way they have behaved in this campaign has been an endless bickering between themselves and Borisov, and the way the government collapsed also showed very little political experience and acumen. So the fact that they do not call, you know, do not attract sort of trust and do not portray legitimacy and experience does not help with those calls. But also they're at a position where the largest party is GERB, and they have ran on an anti-GERB platform, and now yet they're found in the peculiar position of having to hold the pro-European line, and the only other partner is GERB. So it is not an easy solution, because when it comes to corruption, the corruption accusations and the division line between corrupt and anti-corrupt, GERB is their biggest enemy after Delian-Peevski. But when it comes to the European versus pro-Russia orientation, they're their biggest allies. So it's a very delicate dance. It's a very difficult operation to make happen. Being able to form this pro-European coalition while pushing GERB to distance itself from Peevski and commit to anti-corruption reforms. But they have to, they really have no other option. They have to try to do this complex and in a very difficult step.
All right. How have historical legacies and political choices shaped the challenges in Bulgaria's public administration reform, particularly regarding transparency and accountability? What is the role of corruption in either consolidating or weakening populist parties in Bulgaria?
Well, certainly corruption has been a major mobilizing factor, because there have been a number of corruption scandals with GERB leading figures, some of them no longer there, such as Tsvetanov. But corruption continues to be a problem. And what is important is to be focused and remain focused on solutions. And we know from other former communist countries who do have a similar bureaucratic legacy of nomenclatura system and highly politicized system, and then after the collapse of communism, highly corrupt system, we do know that one thing that works is electronic government. So the reform of the public administration and the adoption of electronic government in ever more sectors and procedures certainly goes a long way, and it has already done a lot to address issues of corruption, especially at the lower level. So what we're dealing with right now is political corruption at the highest level, and its embodiment is certainly Peevski, who just with the registration of the party proved that not only he controls the prosecution, but he also controls the courts, and he's able also to influence party behavior from within of other parties. And the fact that he managed to muster more votes than the founder of this party, Ahmet Dugan, and that his votes, only 25% of those votes came from ethnic Turks, but he gathered over 50% of the Roma population votes, means that also he has a lot of money to spend on elections and on vote buying, because a good number of those votes are bought and purchased votes. While the other splinter party, Alliance for Freedom, and Rights and Freedom, having over 50% of the ethnic Turkish vote and the majority of the ethnic Turkish vote abroad, really shows that it is the party that is recognized by ethnic Turks as the party representing them. Nevertheless, Delian-Peevski has been able to sort of hijack the party and to purchase votes and gather 280,000 votes. This is a lot. It's a lot of money.
All right. How does voter perception of corruption differ from expert evaluations in Bulgaria? And what does this reveal about the public tolerance for corruption among political parties? How does the relationship between ethnic identity and party support complicate anti-corruption voting behavior in Bulgaria? And what role does voter apathy or fatalism about corruption play in shaping the success of anti-corruption parties like There Is Such a People?
So certainly we have a political culture with low trust in institutions. And that certainly doesn't help because it does create, open opportunities for anti-establishment rhetoric, allowing populist parties from across the political spectrum to benefit from this sort of low trust and anti-establishment attitude. At the same time, I think that the perception of corruption, there's certainly dissonance between actual corruption, perceived corruption, and experienced corruption. Corruption is a huge problem in Bulgaria at the high level. There is political control of over prosecution. There are political control over distribution of EU funds. So those are some very, very real problems with corruption. And again, they allow for easily exploiting this topic by every new party, including there is such people. But again, the question is, what are the solutions? And which one of those parties is actually offering viable solutions? We have seen judicial reforms being pushed in the during the last regular government with the help of GERB, PPDB, and Delian Peevski. And we see that many of those reforms were just ill-designed. And they are mostly targeted towards a specific political situation, a specific set of political characters. And 10 years from now, they may prove as problematic as you know, the current laws. So again, you know, we need to move away from witch hunting and divorce ourselves from political characters at the time when we think about institutional solutions and mechanisms to fight corruption and prevent opportunities for corruption from happening in the first place.
How have the war in Ukraine and the Russian influence in the country affected populism and nationalism in Bulgaria?
Well, it has certainly allowed parties like Vazrazhdane to increase tenfold their support in the past 3 years. Because in Bulgaria, there is a combination of genuine pro-Russian sentiments due to Bulgaria's long history and the war for independence, a communist regime that was supported by Moscow that benefited large portions of the population at the expense, of course, of harming other large portions of the population. But you have genuine support for everything Russian in Bulgaria that goes deep. We're talking about families and generations who feel affinity with this language, with this culture, with this country, and with this sort of worldview. And at the same time, the war in Ukraine has put many of those people with moderate views who may be pro-European, but at the same time are not anti-Russian, they have been put in a dilemma where they had to choose between their progressive pro-European views and their affinity for Russia. So this has allowed parties like Vazrazhdane to grow. But also, you know, we see another starkly pro-Russian party, the Bulgarian Socialist Party, which has close to disappeared. They have lost over 1 million voters in a few years to now being under 8%, a party that just in the 2017 elections had close to 30%. So there is limit to the pro-Russian, anti-Russian rhetoric and its mobilizing power. But certainly we have probably at least a third of the population that is starkly pro-Russian and about half of the population that supports a position of neutrality in this war. So the position of the European Union and sort of the Western world in this war is not easy to swallow for a lot of voters in Bulgaria.
How do you explain the mushrooming of populist parties in Bulgaria? What are the similarities and differences with other populist parties in Europe?
There's a lot of similarities and differences, and much more so than what we expect. Certainly, there's a lot of variety. What we've seen that across Europe, whether it's east or west, north or south, we have mushrooming of populist parties. We also have within each country a great variation. In Bulgaria, we have seen populist parties from the center and the right, but in other East European countries like Slovakia, we see them also from the left. So there's a lot of variation, but again, what has become firmly established is this populist formula of very strong emotional appeals with a charismatic figure pointing to sharp divisions and real problems in many cases in society, but with no real solutions and sort of big promises and quick fixes that do not turn in practice. And again, in the long run, this truly erodes the foundation of democracy because it breeds voters who are less patient and who are less loyal. That means that party identification and party loyalty become a luxury, and we're talking about dealing with the momentous mood of the day and the momentous crisis of the day and the ability of different sort of charismatic figures in a TV show like setting, playing, performing in order to attract more votes. It is a Europe-wide trend, certainly in a country that does not have an established party system. It is much easier to erode what was not there in the first place.
Why have populist radical right parties significantly increased their share of the vote in the June 2024 European Parliament elections? And what key issues have driven their success? How has the Turkish minority influenced the mobilization of nationalist votes? And what role does ethnic and nationalist populism play in the strategies of Bulgarian political actors, particularly regarding the Turkish minority and the Movement for Rights and Freedoms Party?
Bulgarian nationalism does exploit anti-Turkish rhetoric, but this is by far not its main mobilizing for argument, because there is another minority in Bulgaria, the Roma minority, which actually has a far stronger mobilizing factor, much more so than the ethnic Turks or even external migrants. So the minority, the Roma minority has traditionally been the other group that has been attacked. And we then have from there stemming a number of narratives such as welfare chauvinism, pensions, schooling and healthcare only to people who pay taxes. We then have the war in Ukraine, pro-Russian sentiments taking place on specific issues such as energy policy. What are we doing with our Lukoil refinery, for example? What do we do with our atomic electric plant and so forth? So again, this mixture of factors do play. And when it comes to the ethnic Turkish minority, the one argument that has fueled sort of these nationalist parties is history books. And the narrative, the discourse in which the Ottoman Empire is depicted, and Bulgaria being, of course, dominated and part of the Ottoman Empire for over 500 years. So the biggest debate there is whether we had the so-called Turkish yoke or whether we had Turkish presence, Turkish dominance, and these are certainly, history books are one battleground for that. The ethnic Turkish minority, on the other hand, has suffered a lot from the historical, from history in Bulgaria, the fact that you did have the renaming process and you had 800,000 ethnic Turks leaving the country, the entire ethnic Turkish minority being subject to decades, but especially in the 80s, to forced assimilation policy, to killings, to expulsions and prosecutions, no right to practice language, culture, religion, and so forth. So you have a situation in which the ethnic Turks simply don't trust anybody. And therefore, they continue to vote for a corrupt party that cashes and uses their vote simply because this party knows that they would never trust another party, because they have been betrayed by the Socialist Party, they have been betrayed by what was the democratic opposition. In fact, the first anti-government protests in communist Bulgaria were not by dissidents, they were by the ethnic Turks. So I completely understand why, being an ethnic Turk, you vote for MRF, and now, of course, you have the dilemma of which one to vote for, but you don't trust any other party. And there have been attempts to reach out to the ethnic Turkish minority, both from the left and from the right, and to sort of capture that vote. But again, the distrust runs very deep because the wound was very, very deep and also very recent. We're talking about events of 30, 40 years ago. So you still have those generations alive, and you still have people with passports with 3 different names. So it would take a while before the ethnic Turkish minority emancipates itself from voting exclusively from an ethnic Turkish party and trusting anybody else.
Right. In your recent article for the ECPS report, you note that period to 2022, 58% of the population reported positive attitudes toward Russia and Putin, suggesting that the war in Ukraine has created fertile ground for PRR parties with strong pro-Russian stance. What are the main reasons behind this pronounced pro-Russian sentiment?
Now, immediately after the war, this percentage dropped sharply, but then it started again climbing as the war continued and as Ukrainian refugees came into the country. So the initial backlash and move away from this generous support of Russia sort of was regained because, again, once refugees from Ukraine started showing up, and once the war sort of dragged on for a year, for a second year, for a third year, you see that people sort of migrated back to their original views. And here, again, we go back to the powerful legacy of a communist regime and a party that had 1 million members and has a lot of families that still continue to revere Russia, regardless of the regime that there is in Russia. And there is little distinction, in fact, between the Russian people and the Russian regime, which becomes problematic because few people would argue against Russian culture and the Russian people, but a lot of people would argue again against Putin's regime, including within Russia. So you do have, again, the historical legacy of Russia being seen as liberator, then a communist regime that has actively promoted Russian culture for many years and the Russian language. And these families and generations of people who grew up with that culture. They studied in Russian schools, they went on professional development in Russia, and also they have not trusted the West to the extent, despite all the benefits of the European Union and all the funds and improved living and mobility and all forth, they still remain deeply skeptical.
And lastly, Professor Zankina, how do you interpret the discrepancy between the low female representation in Bulgaria's populist radical right parties and the comparatively high level of activity on women's issues among PRR women MPs? How might the presence of women in PRR parties in Bulgaria influence broader perceptions of these parties as Mannerparten, and what factors contribute to this dynamic?
We do know there's numerous research, not only mine, but by many authors, that populist radical right parties are man-partine, they're men's parties, because they're represented by women, by men, they're supported by men, and they exclusively sort of serve men. But we also have seen again that there is a female narrative of traditional family values that has been, although not prevalent, firmly established, starting from, you know, the UK to France, to to all the East European countries. And we do see also that parties themselves have staged women as sort of a tactic and an instrument to be more appealing to the female voters, and also as a more legitimate way to promote specific policies. When you're talking about gender issues, when you're talking about reproductive rights, when you're talking about family services, and you have actually a woman doing it, it gives a lot more legitimacy. So parties also themselves, as a strategy, have co-opted more women and promoted more women to the fore. Yet for the moment, the appeal continues to still be predominantly towards male voters, and the representation as well. Despite such efforts, if you look at the gender balance in those parties, in electoral lists and among the MPs, it is still predominantly male.
Professor Zankina, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.